If you've spent any time in the Old Testament of the Bible, there's a pretty good chance you've stumbled across the name Baal more than once. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of misunderstanding over who Baal was and what his importance was to those who worshipped him. And that's what we're talking about today. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. So before we get started, who is Baal? For anybody unfamiliar, Baal was the chief storm god of the land of Canaan. This is the land that the Israelites moved in to occupy after their exodus from Egypt. And even though the Israelites were only supposed to worship Yahweh, the God who had taken them out of slavery in Egypt and moved them into the land of Canaan, the presence of the cult of Baal within the land of Canaan meant that many Israelites, over the years and centuries to come, would inevitably turn away from worshiping Yahweh alone to worshiping Baal in addition to Yahweh. As a result, many of the biblical texts, especially the historical and the prophetic texts, speak disparagingly of the figure of Baal, which suggests that despite Israelite attempts to drive Baal worship out of the land that they occupied, it nevertheless remained a consistent problem throughout the centuries. I also want to make clear to any fellow Christians in the audience that Baal is never identified as Satan in the Old Testament. This is a comparison that I see made quite frequently, and I think it comes from the fact that Baal is often depicted as the rival of God in the Old Testament. But to my knowledge, there's no biblical or even non-biblical text that equates Satan and Baal as the same spiritual figure. So just wanted to throw that out there, because I've seen that becoming increasingly popular online. So let's get started. First, we should know that the name Baal is technically a title meaning Lord or Master. It's used frequently in the ancient Hebrew Bible as well as in many other inscriptions from the contemporary peoples around them to refer to a ruler, either human or divine, who is the master of a given area. It can be used for gods, it can be used for a particular god, or it can be used for ordinary people, well, ruling people. That being said, there were particular circumstances in which a reference to Baal unambiguously refers to the deity Baal. As we've already established, Baal was the chief storm god of the Canaanites, but he was also worshipped by the northern neighbors of the Canaanites in Phoenicia. Now, technically, Phoenicia and Canaan really shouldn't be disambiguated from each other all too strongly. They didn't really have a definitive border between the land of Canaan and the land of Phoenicia, and their neighbors to the west and east consider them one and the same, essentially. And that pans out in the archaeological record as well. The material culture, inscriptional evidence, and genetic data suggest that Phoenicians and Canaanites were essentially indistinguishable from each other. So it shouldn't be a surprise when we see the Canaanite storm god Baal worshipped in Phoenicia as well. They were considered one region at the time. Now, that being said, I think it's interesting to note that the deity Baal was only worshipped, as far as we can tell, by the Canaanites/Phoenicians. Excavations from the ancient Semitic city of Ebla to the north of ancient Phoenicia suggest that Baal wasn't worshipped in the city of Ebla itself, despite being relatively close to Phoenicia. However, some records from Eblite archives suggest that visitors from the southern region of Phoenicia visited the city, and they had the name Baal worked into their own names. So that suggests that the worship of Baal is quite old, dating back to the time that Ebla was built, which would be around 2300 BC, but the worship of Baal hadn't spread outside of Phoenicia, so that the city of Ebla, even though it knew people who worshipped Baal, didn't worship Baal themselves. This evidence is reinforced by the dig site at modern-day Abu Salabik, dating back to ancient Mesopotamia in the Far East. At Abu Salabik, we also find names of foreigners who traveled to the city, which incorporate the name of Baal. These were probably visitors who ventured all the way from Phoenicia, all the way east through the Fertile Crescent to Mesopotamia. And yet, there was no cult specifically to Baal in ancient Mesopotamia, only to the ancient Sumerian god Ishkur and his later successor Hadad. So it seems that Baal was originally a Canaanite or Phoenician god who was worshipped almost exclusively in that coastal region on the eastern Mediterranean. Yet most of the time when we encounter the figure of Baal in ancient texts, and sometimes in the Hebrew Bible itself, he isn't simply called Baal. Very frequently he's understood as Baal Hadad. And the Hadad element of that name is really important, because originally Hadad was a separate storm deity, who later became merged with the Phoenician deity Baal. While Baal was ostensibly only worshipped in Phoenicia on the coastal region of the ancient Mediterranean, Hadad was an inland storm deity. His worship is attested first in central Mesopotamia, and it seems that as the cult of Hadad moved west, it incorporated elements of the Baal cult already present in Phoenicia, and thus the deity Baal Hadad was born. Something similar happened when Semitic peoples from central Mesopotamia moved east, where they identified Hadad with the native Sumerian deity Ishkur. This happened quite frequently in the ancient world. when one tribal people moves to a new area, they would very frequently identify their gods together that carried the same function. Now, although both Hadad and Baal were storm gods, they had very different personalities in the myths that talk about them. And the personality attached to the storm god seems to be related to the type of storms experienced by the people who worship that deity. For instance, Alberto Green identifies Baal as a relatively gentle and benevolent god in the mythology of the people who worshipped him. This rather makes sense because storms in Phoenicia were regular and seasonal. There's a dry season and a rainy season. And when the rainy season came around, it was considered to be a bounteous season where crops would begin growing again, with the relatively gentle monsoons that swept off the Mediterranean. In central Mesopotamia, on the other hand, Hadad was considered to be a warlike deity. In fact, he beats his war drum very frequently in the text that he shows up in. Part of the reason for this is because storms in central Mesopotamia, even up to the present day, are very aggressive and lead to the flooding of the Euphrates River, which can temporarily, if not permanently, displace entire people groups. So Hadad, coming from a place where storms were more threatening, was seen as violent and warlike, whereas Baal, coming from a place where storms were seen as fertilizing and bounteous, was seen as a more gentle deity. As we'll discuss later, the incorporation of Hadad into the figure of Baal led to the figure of Baal Hadad being portrayed as both a bounteous giver of life and a cunning warrior, but we'll talk about that soon. Now, I should note that while many Phoenicians seem to have identified their god Baal with the foreign god Hadad from central Mesopotamia, there were many people who continued to worship Baal with no reference to Hadad, and Hadad with no reference to Baal. In fact, as late as 850 AD, Aramaean tribes were still worshiping Hadad in central Mesopotamia with no mention of Baal. In fact, inscriptional evidence from many of the Aramaean tribes who feature in the Bible itself suggests that these people primarily worshipped Hadad and not Baal. The Tel Dan stele, for instance, which is an Aramaean report of victory over the Israelites, offers the victory to Hadad with no mention of Baal made whatsoever. Likewise, the Aramaean king of Aram Damascus, Hazael, who shows up repeatedly in the Old Testament text, has inscriptional evidence relating to his worship of Hadad without any mention of the worship of Baal. Now, importantly, one Aramaean city-state, the city-state of Hamath, does attest the worship of Baal Shemayim. In fact, there's no attestation of Hadad within the inscriptional evidence of this city whatsoever. And the reason for that is probably because while Hamath was an Aramaean city-state and thus it was populated by ethnic Aramaeans for the most part, it had coastline, and the Phoenicians were a primarily coastal people. So it seems that there was a large Phoenician component to the city-state of Hamath, which led to Phoenician identification of the storm god. Primarily Baal was the one who was in charge there, and any elements of the Hadad identity were secondary to Baal's. So it seems that while the influence of Hadad made its way west into Phoenicia and even south into ancient Sumer, the cult of Baal never really expanded eastwards. The Aramaean city-states who were further east worshipped Hadad almost exclusively with very little sign of Baal influence, whereas in Phoenicia, Baal and Hadad were so closely identified that texts could refer to Hadad and know that you would imagine Baal in your own mind. So closely connected were the two storm deities, at least in some Phoenician places. The figure of Baal would be known in later texts as late as 800 AD as Baal Shemayim, which means Baal of Heaven or Lord of Heaven. This is the epithet found in many late Phoenician and Canaanite inscriptions referring to Baal, and it seems to have adopted some solar connotations with this name as well, using sun imagery to describe Baal, which is uncommon in ancient Phoenician texts. When the Greeks incorporated Phoenicia into their territory after the conquest of Alexander, Baal Shemayim was the one who was identified as Zeus in Phoenician clothing. So to summarize all of that, Baal originally began as a Canaanite/Phoenician storm deity, whereas Hadad began as a central Mesopotamian storm deity. As people from central Mesopotamia moved west into Phoenician territory, Baal and Hadad were identified together as the same deity until they became known as Baal Hadad. Baal Hadad, the fusion of the gentle Baal and the warlike Hadad, is likely the Baal that we encounter in the biblical texts as the enemy of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And thus it's likely Baal Hadad who is worshipped by the Canaanites and by the fallen Israelites who would follow after them. I want to talk now a little bit about Baal's family because this actually makes contact with another video I made a little while ago on Dagon. Go ahead and check that out if you're interested in this sort of thing with considerably less budget. In many ancient Phoenician texts, Baal is depicted as being the son of El being the high god of the Phoenician pantheon. Yet in some texts, Baal is likewise referred to as being the son of Dagon, a different deity probably related to grain from central Mesopotamia. And interestingly enough, sometimes he'll be referred to as the son of El, and then later as the son of Dagon in the same literary document. So what's going on there? Well, as it turns out, because we now know that Hadad and Baal were originally separate deities, we actually have the solution to this problem. It's probably the case that Baal was assumed to be the son of El in Phoenician mythology, whereas in central Mesopotamian mythology, Hadad was considered to be the son of Dagon. And so when Baal and Hadad were merged together into a single deity, Baal Hadad, they had double divine parentage regarding their fathers. Although Dagon and El were never really totally identified with one another, so there's a problem with Baal having two fathers. This probably wouldn't have been particularly difficult for the ancients to wrap their heads around. They probably didn't need a logical explanation for why Baal has two dads and two moms to go with it. But it's a satisfactory explanation for us today as to why we find texts referring to Baal as son of Hadad and Baal as son of Dagon in different angles. Baal is also referred to as the brother and sometimes husband of the Canaanite war goddess Anat, and that's as far as I'm going into that topic right now. So now that we've talked about who Baal is, let's talk a little bit about what Baal does. As I've mentioned already, Baal was first and foremost a storm god. This means that he was related to the fertility of the land itself by providing the rain that fecundates the earth and allows crops to grow. This became increasingly popular and important as Phoenician cities moved towards a more agricultural style, this taking place potentially as far back as the Stone Age. The primary aim of Baal's role as a storm god is to provide fertility to the land by causing crops to grow. And it's appropriate in some ways to understand Baal's primary function not just as a storm god, but as a god of fertility, as he isn't only related to the fertility of crops, but also of animals and in some cases even people. Baal's role as a fertility deity relating to animals comes out expressly in the classic children's story, Baal fathers a bull. And if you think that's weird, you'd be right, but that actually isn't the only time this happens, because it also takes place in another Phoenician story called The Wilderness. That's all I'm going to say about that. We're moving on. But not only was Baal responsible for the fertility and thus the life of your agricultural crops, of your herds, and even of human families, he was also responsible for maintaining the life of souls after they've departed and gone down to the grave itself. Because of his life-giving power, Baal was considered to be the patron deity of the dead, at least the spirits of the dead who linger in their graves. So essentially, Baal was the patron god of the cult of the dead. If you want to know more about the cult of the dead, you can watch the video I did on that linked here. But essentially, the cult of the dead served to connect living people with their recently or even long deceased family members. And Baal was the patron deity who looked over the souls of the dead and brought them into contact with their living family members. This was operated by Baal's time spent in the underworld and time spent in the world of the living. You see, ancient Phoenicia enjoyed two different primary seasons, the dry season and the rainy season. During the dry season, it was believed that Baal was lingering in the realm of the dead, where he served as the god of the deceased and operated functions in the realm of the dead itself. But come rainy season, Baal had returned to the land of the living, and with him would often bring up the souls of the dead to commune, if only temporarily, with their living relatives. And the sign of Baal's return to the realm of the living was the coming of the rainy season, which was marked by Baal sending of rain to produce fertility for crops and animals and even people alike. So in ancient Phoenician belief, Baal wasn't just the person who made it rain and affected the weather in that way. He was a deity relating to fertility of crops, animals, people, and of life in general, life beyond the grave, and making sure that there was prolonged contact between living and deceased family members through the cult of the dead. So everything we've talked about so far fits pretty well with the gentle storm god of Baal from Phoenicia, but this is Baal Hadad we're talking about, remember, so the warrior element's going to come out sooner or later. Owing to the fusion between Baal and the warlike storm god Hadad from central Mesopotamia, Baal Hadad is depicted in several texts as being a very violent and warlike deity. His primary opponents were the sea dragons who lived in the Mediterranean. Sea dragons were a common symbol in the ancient world for chaos, and so Baal's killing of the sea serpents was symbolic of imposing order on a very chaotic realm. Baal's victory over monsters that live in the sea led to the collection of votive anchors being deposited in the temple of Baal at Ugarit. These are essentially little boat anchors made probably by the families of sailors, and they were given to the Baal temple as an offering in return for the safety of their family members who were sailing abroad. But sea monsters aren't the only thing that Baal has on his menu. He also picks a fight with the god of death, Mot. In fact, it's thanks to Mot that we actually get the cycle of Baal entering into the realm of the dead before returning to the realm of the living, exemplified through the rainy and dry season cycle that the ancient Phoenicians experienced. The text referring to the conflict between Baal and Mot is poorly preserved. The tablets have been damaged in several areas just by the passing of time. But it seems that Mot approaches Baal and challenges him to battle, and at some point Baal is swallowed by Mot, and he goes down into the underworld. It's sort of unclear what happens after this point, but it seems that through some means of the other gods pleading with Mot, or perhaps making an offering to him, Baal is allowed to return to the land of the living, if only temporarily. So even though the exact wording of the tablets have been damaged, we can be pretty sure that this is the explanation for why there's a rainy season and a dry season in ancient Phoenician lore. Essentially, they understand the reason for why there's a dry season as Baal being ritually swallowed by the death god Mot and spending time in the underworld, where he's tending to the souls of the dead. And the coming of the rainy season comes as a result of Baal's return to the land of the living. And this explains the weather cycle for the ancient Phoenicians who worshipped Baal. Additional expressions of Baal as a warrior show up in the Israelite Kirbet el-Qom inscription, in which El blesses Baal for a coming battle, and from Phoenician inscriptions where Baal shows up as the brother of the war goddess Anat, with the two of them fighting side by side in some texts. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of who Baal is, let's talk about the relationship between Baal and the God of Israel as it shows up in the Bible itself. To drastically oversimplify the situation, the ancient Israelites generally fell into two categories. The first category were the Yahwists. These were people who worshipped Yahweh, the God of Israel, exclusively. They believed that Yahweh had given them the command that they should worship no other gods but him after their exodus from Egypt. And these were the people who wrote the Bible that we still enjoy today. The other group of ancient Israelites were syncretists. Syncretism is the practice of merging more than one different culture together and producing something of a mixture of the two out of them, similar to how Hadad culture and Baal culture mixed together. These Israelites weren't so much interested in merging Yahweh and Baal as they were worshiping Baal in addition to Yahweh, in addition to a plurality of other gods they picked up from Canaan and from the surrounding areas. So like I mentioned, the biblical texts were primarily written by the people who worshipped Yahweh alone, the Yahwists. The people who worshipped Yahweh in addition to other gods were seen as people who broke the covenant that Yahweh had made with the people and are portrayed generally negatively in the Bible. And thus Baal worship in the Bible is seen as a sign of compromise and a breaking of the covenant. The ancient Israelites moved out of the land of Egypt during the Exodus and into the land of Canaan, where the worship of Baal was already widespread at the time. And once the Israelites moved in, many of them adopted Baal worship seemingly instantly. Already in the period of the Judges, very early in ancient Israel's history, the judge Gideon names his son Jerubbaal. You'll notice that the name Baal is a part of this proper name. This is what's called a theophoric name, which is where you incorporate the name of a deity that you worship into the name of one of your children when you give them your name. And so for an Israelite to name their son after Baal and not Yahweh, or a generic term for God, suggests that the worship of Baal was already very well set in the earliest land that the Israelites settled in. The theophoric names Ishbaal and Meribaal both show up in the tribe of Benjamin, and both of whom are related to the first king of Israel, Saul, which suggests that in the early days of the Israelite monarchy, the worship of Baal was still practiced relatively widely. So why might the worship of Baal have been such a problem for the ancient Israelites? Why not just worship Yahweh like you're supposed to and get along with life? Well, the primary reason is that Baal was the local storm god. When the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness, Yahweh was taking care of all of their needs. But now they're not wandering anymore. They're living in a land and they need their crops to grow. How do crops grow? Well, Baal makes them grow. So you better be on good terms with Baal if you want your crops to grow and thus your business to succeed and thus your family to eat. It was probably as a result of this need that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was increasingly identified as a storm god in the iconography attributed to him in middle and late biblical texts. But in the earliest texts, which come from before the time that the Israelites were settled in the land, there's very few storm god attributes applied to Yahweh. He's more of a war god and a god of the wilderness than he is a god of fertilized fields and valleys, because when they were wandering in the desert, they didn't need fertilized fields and valleys. They were nomads. But when they're in the land itself, they need a god who can provide them with rain. And if Yahweh didn't provide it to them, they were just going to worship Baal. So a lot of the storm god imagery that's applied to Yahweh was probably composed in competition with the local Baal cults, which already had an established foothold. Essentially, the Yahweh Alone Club was saying, you don't need to worship Baal because Yahweh is going to give us everything we need by fulfilling all of the functions that any god could possibly provide us. Whereas the syncretists were saying, well, Yahweh's our national God. He's a great war God. He led us here. He brought us through the wilderness. But now it's Hadad's turn to kind of take over the agriculture department. As a result of this rivalry, it became increasingly popular to depict Yahweh in the functions and attributes that Baal had as an alternative to the Baal cult. This expressly comes out in the rivalry between Baal and his two rivals, the sea, embodied in the sea deity Yam, and death, embodied by the death deity Mot. The word Mot is literally the ancient Phoenician word for death, so it works out pretty well. Now, both of these stories were very important for the ancient Phoenicians. Baal's defeat of Yam and the sea monsters emphasized the victory of order over chaos. The gods defeated the monsters of chaos and allowed order to reign in the land itself. And if the monsters had won, then chaos would have reigned forever and civilization would have been impossible. Likewise, Baal's complicated relationship with death explains the life and death cycle of the natural world and even the thing that all human beings must undergo. Remember, this was a matter of fertility for the land itself, with a rainy season and a dry season, a time for birthing cows and non-birthing cows, and a time for human souls to live in the land of the living and go down to the land of the dead. Now, Israelite literature talking about Yahweh will frequently riff on these materials. In the book of Isaiah, for instance, we find several references to Yahweh being the one who defeats the sea monster. So essentially, they're taking the myth of Baal and they're taking Baal out of it and making Yahweh the chief player in that myth. This doesn't mean that the Israelites adopted the whole of the mythology of Phoenicia, but rather they're making the point that it's Yahweh who establishes order out of chaos and not Baal. So with the Yam myth, the chaos monster myth, they've essentially made Yahweh the hero instead of Baal. But something different happens with the Mot myth. Rather than depicting Yahweh standing in the place of Baal and thus being swallowed by Mot and there being a whole cycle of dry season, rainy season, rather we see that death was never inextricably linked with Yahweh in the ancient world. In fact, Psalm 88 suggests that Yahweh doesn't have a whole lot to do with the realm of the dead. Rather, the language from the Mot cycle, from the Baal cycle itself, suggests that Yahweh uses death as a weapon against his enemies rather than being devoured by it and being spat out the other side again. Now, there's still language from the Baal cycle being incorporated into this statement, specifically Mot's massive jaws opening wide to swallow whole. Well, in the Baal cycle, it opens wide to swallow Baal, to swallow him down to the land of the underworld, and thus begin the cycle of dry season, rainy season. Yet in the Bible itself, Yahweh causes the jaws of death to open up wide to swallow up his enemies and those who live foolish lives. This may sound like plagiarism to you or me, but it would make perfect sense to anybody who was living in this ancient world who was familiar with these myths, especially for anybody who was an active Baal worshiper who had heard the myths of Baal, his defeat of Yam, his duel, I suppose, with Mot. Hearing Yahweh as the protagonist of the battle against chaos and having a different relationship against death would be readily understandable to anybody who heard it in the ancient world. It is getting absurdly dark in here. It is like 6 o'clock. I don't know why the sun is setting so early. So now let's talk about the worship of Baal in the ancient culture of the Israelites, because that's where a lot of this is coming to play in the biblical texts themselves. For a quick outline of ancient Israelite history, the Exodus from Egypt probably took place sometime around 1250 BC. The exact date is virtually impossible to determine, but probably around then. The monarchy was established probably around 1000 BC, first with King Saul, and then moving on to King David, and eventually to his son Solomon. Solomon died around 930 BC, in fact, in 930 BC, and after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel was split in two. There was a northern kingdom ruled by an outsider named Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and the southern kingdom, which was ruled by Solomon's son, Rehoboam. The northern kingdom continued as an independent force from the southern kingdom until 722 BC, when it was conquered by the ancient Neo-Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom continued on its own until 586 BC, when it was finally conquered and destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There's a lot of information there, but this is going to be important soon, I promise. Let's talk about the northern kingdom first. The northern kingdom was established, as I said, around 930 by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who was of no blood relation to King David and the southern dynasty that he founded. The northern kingdom was notoriously polytheistic in the biblical text. They seem to have worshipped a variety of gods in addition to Yahweh, and by the time of the Omri dynasty, which we'll talk about in a second here, Yahweh alone worship seems to have been the dramatic minority. In the mid-800s BC, the Omri dynasty came to power in ancient Israel. This was one of the few dynasties that actually had multiple generations sitting on the throne, and it was begun by a man named Omri. Omri came at the tail end of 3 continuous regicides, one after the other. A man kills the king of the northern kingdom, establishes himself as king, and then is shortly thereafter assassinated by somebody else. Omri put an end to this process by declaring himself king and establishing his dynasty quite soundly. Omri was responsible for building the new capital city of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and building a temple to Baal in that city itself. After this point, less so in Hebrew texts, but more so in broader texts from the Assyrians and other ancient cultures, the northern kingdom took on the name Samaria. This is not to be confused with the ancient land of Sumer, where the Sumerians lived. Samaria and the Sumerians were 2 completely different people. But if you are thinking of the Samaritans from the New Testament, you're in luck, because they are distant descendants of the northern kingdom people. But there'll be some complications before we get there. We'll move on. Although Omri was a successful general and an even more successful king in some regards, he would be overshadowed by the fame, or perhaps infamy, of his son Ahab. One of Omri's last things that he did while he was still king was establish the marriage between his son Ahab and the princess of the Phoenician city Sidon to the far north, Jezebel. Ahab, with a Baal-worshipping father and a Baal-worshipping wife, would become the most pro-Baal king in the entire history of the northern kingdom, with one possible exception. Now, for most of the northern kingdom's history, the worship of Yahweh was probably primary and the worship of Baal was probably secondary. But there are some signs that indicate that during the reign of Ahab, he attempted to elevate Baal to the primary status and relegate Yahweh to a lower status in the Israelite pantheon. I would suggest that if this was the case, then it was probably to strengthen relations between the northern Israelite kingdom and the Phoenician city-states to the north, whose princess Jezebel had married Ahab and who were very prolific Baal worshippers. So making Baal the chief god of your nation would be a really good thing to, work your way in with your in-laws. And it's Ahab's actions here that precipitate the largest duel between Yahweh and Baal in the entirety of the Old Testament, the duel at Mount Carmel. As the biblical story goes, Ahab and Jezebel were very pro-Baal figures, and they were hunting down those who refused to worship Baal and maintained that only Yahweh alone should be worshipped. One of these people was the prophet Elijah, who was in the dramatic minority by the time he appears on the scene, and is chased in the wilderness by the Baal-worshipping king and queen. While Elijah is hiding in the wilderness, a very unfortunate irony sets itself upon the northern kingdom. There is a prolonged drought. That rainy season, dry season thing, well, it's hanging out in the dry season for a little bit too long, and people are starting to get worried. But crisis always breeds opportunity, and so Elijah challenges the priests of Baal to a duel at the top of Mount Carmel. During this season of drought, the Baal priests would make an offering to Baal in return for rain. After this, Elijah would make an offering of his own to Yahweh in return for rain, and whichever god responds with rain to end the drought will become the god of Israel. Straightforward enough. So Ahab, Jezebel, and the prophets of Baal agree. They all meet on the top of Mount Carmel, and the Baal prophets make their sacrifice to Baal, and nothing happens. Baal, the storm god, does not offer them rain in return. Elijah, on the other hand, makes his offering, and he's all like,
"Curse you, Baal! I hereby vow you will rue this day. Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide with a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being."
Yahweh strikes Elijah's altar with lightning, consuming the sacrifice, and immediately rain starts to fall. You can already see the storm god imagery being used for Yahweh as opposed to Baal, who was not able to produce either lightning to consume the sacrifice or rain to benefit the nation. Scholars in the 1960s and onward began to see this as the watershed moment between Baal worship and Yahweh worship in the northern kingdom. It's probably an exaggeration to say that this was like the only time that something of this nature happened, but it definitely was a very important moment in the cultural history of the northern kingdom. It's also worth noting that while this duel is taking place, as the prophets of Baal are praying to Baal for rain and for lightning, Elijah is taunting them, saying maybe Baal can't hear you, maybe he's sleeping, maybe he's on a journey. And to us, this sounds childish and pedantic, but in reality, the ancient view of what deities did and were actually allowed for these possibilities. A great example of this is the Atrahasis epic from ancient Babylon. In this story, the chief of the gods, Enlil, decides to wipe out all of humankind because they're making too much noise and they're disturbing his sleep. So Baal being asleep is actually a real possibility that the Baal prophets had to put up with. Now, although Yahweh and his prophet Elijah won the victory at Mount Carmel, this didn't mean that Ahab and Jezebel immediately turned around their lives and began worshiping Yahweh instead of Baal. In fact, very little seems to have been accomplished by this. But the Omride dynasty, powerful and relatively long-lived as it was about to come to a crashing halt, as a new king of Israel became a regicide himself and set himself up on the throne. Many years after Elijah foretold the downfall of Ahab's house, his pupil Elisha would find a military general in the northern kingdom named Jehu. Elisha would offer Jehu the chance to become the king of the northern kingdom of Israel in return for a small fee. Jehu would have to eliminate Baal worship and reinstate Yahweh worship. After Ahab died in battle, the house of Omri was weak, with a young and inexperienced king on the throne and his mother Jezebel pulling the strings. Jehu seized upon the opportunity and wiped out the entire house of Ahab, cleansing the Omrides from the world and reestablishing Yahweh worship as the primary aim of the northern kingdom. But Jehu was tactical. Rather than announcing himself as a proud Yahwist from day one, he rather told the priests of Baal that he was very interested in Baal worship and asked them to assemble all of the priests and prophets of Baal to the temple of Baal that Omri had built in Samaria. Once they arrived, Jehu locked the doors, set the temple on fire, and broke the pillars so that the temple of Baal collapsed with all of its priests and prophets under its burning roof. He also slaughtered the entire house of Omri and all the family of Ahab to ensure that nobody from that dynasty would ever take his place again in the future by taking revenge. This was pretty common fare in the ancient world. Anytime a dynastic shift took power, it made kind of sense to wipe out the previous dynasty to ensure that nobody would reassert their claim to the throne and attempt to overthrow you. But this wasn't always the way that it took place. A great example of this is King David himself. After King David became king after the house of Saul fell, he actually went out of his way to do good things for the dynasty that he had replaced. Jehu, it seems, went the other, more classical direction on this, and even the prophets of God, like Hosea, said that he probably went a little bit too far with the bloodshed. Now, in spite of Jehu's program, he wasn't able to completely cleanse Baal worship from the northern kingdom. It would return a couple of generations later, and it would even continue after the Israelite state had fallen, all the way to the Hellenistic period. But there was a definitive paradigm shift with the house of Jehu, which would continue to reign for far longer than even the Omrides had managed, making it one of the most long-lived dynasties in the northern kingdom's history. Now let's fast forward roughly 78 years later. This is during the reign of King Hoshea, the last king of the northern kingdom. Hoshea reintroduced Baal worship to the northern kingdom. How it had been operating prior to his time is unclear, but it probably remained in the land in some capacity. Hoshea reintroduced it in an official capacity, but he didn't get to enjoy it for very long, because in the late 700s BC, he was approached by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Now, the Neo-Assyrians had been feuding for a long time with the northern kingdom, as well as the Aramaean tribes in the city-states of Phoenicia, but in the reign of Shalmaneser V, they were finally breaking through and conquering these one by one. And in the reign of Hoshea, the Neo-Assyrians finally conquered the northern kingdom. And they did allow Hoshea to remain the king of Israel as sort of a vassal to the Neo-Assyrians, but unfortunately, they later suspected him of treason and deported him to Assyria. They also deported the majority of the Israelites from the northern kingdom and imported Assyrians into the kingdom in their place. This was common Neo-Assyrian tactics to ensure that by the second generation, everybody in a land that they conquered would be Assyrian, and thus they would owe loyalty to the Assyrian Empire. By the way, this is the origin of the lost 10 tribes, because when the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom split, 2 tribes remained in the south, and 10 tribes moved with the northern kingdom to break off from the southern kingdom. And thus, when Shalmaneser deported the northern kingdom's population, that was essentially the 10 tribes going into exile into Assyria and being replaced with Assyrians. The immigrant Assyrians would mix with the remainders of the northern kingdom, and they would eventually, in time, become known as the Samaritans. At first, these people were polytheists. They worshipped Yahweh, the god of the land that they inhabited, but they also worshipped the gods of Assyria and of the broader world. Although by the time of Jesus, a lot had changed, and they were exclusively Yahweh worshippers, albeit in a way different from their southern Jewish neighbors. So as we've seen, Baal was very important to the religious life of many people in the northern kingdom of Israel. But this is only one half of the divided monarchy. The southern kingdom still remains. Now, it's important to note that we saw several regicides in the course of the Northern Kingdom's history. In fact, there were 7 in total during its relatively brief lifespan. Essentially, one king would establish himself as king of the Northern Kingdom, and then he or his son would be killed, and another person would take their place from outside of the new royal family. This never happened in the Southern Kingdom. Although regicides did happen, there was always a blood relative and descendant of King David who remained on the throne. This was due in part to nationalistic pride. King David was from the tribe of Judah, which is one of the 2 tribes, and honestly the bigger of the 2, which remained with David's descendants after the northern tribes succeeded. Now, importantly, the kings of the southern kingdom saw a special relationship between the dynasty of King David, which they belonged to, and Yahweh, the God of Israel. They believed that Yahweh had made a covenant with David, that one of his descendants would always sit on the throne of Israel. And so, even if a king wasn't particularly attached to the worship of Yahweh, it was in the best interest of himself and his line to worship Yahweh so that they could maintain that covenant relationship and thus enjoy the protection of their dynasty. And whether you believe in that sort of thing or not, it worked. There was always a descendant of King David sitting on the throne. Yahweh was no longer just the God of Moses and the God of the patriarchs, but the God of David and his descendants, and thus there was a royal element attached to the worship of Yahweh in the southern kingdom. And this preference for Yahweh really shows, because while Baal worship was really common in the northern kingdom, we have very little evidence of it in the southern kingdom. Archaeological digs from Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom, which King Omri built, revealed that a lot of people were naming their children theophoric names featuring Baal. Baal helps, Baal is my god, things of that nature. And yet from none of our archaeological or literary remnants of the southern kingdom do Baal names ever show up. And that isn't just because the southern Israelites were less polytheistic than their northern neighbors. Well, compared to them, they probably were. But Solomon, the son of David, was a huge polytheist. This guy, who was the son of the chief king in Israelite history and a great guy in and of himself, was notorious for worshiping multiple ancient gods of the neighboring peoples. He worshipped Milcom, he worshipped Chemosh, he worshipped Asherah. But he didn't worship Baal, and that's interesting, because again, Baal was seen as the rival to Yahweh in many respects. They couldn't be in the same house together, and yet these other lesser gods were probably a little bit less offensive, at least from outward appearances, than Baal would have been. It would kind of be like going to a Minnesota Vikings game wearing any other sort of jersey. It's kind of like, God, I really don't like that, but whatever. But if you show up wearing a Green Bay Packers jersey, there's something wrong with you. Even in the historical documents of 1st and 2nd Kings, which give a history of the southern kingdom, the worship of Baal isn't a consistent problem like it is in the northern kingdom. Sure, one king here makes molten images of Baal, and another king there destroys those molten images, but the primary problem in the southern kingdom seems to have been worshiping a variety of other lesser deities alongside Yahweh, rather than a direct rivalry between Baal and Yahweh like it was in the northern kingdom. Thus, we really don't have a duel at Mount Carmel in the southern kingdom, because there wasn't that direct rivalry there. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the southern kingdom of Israel fell to the Neo-Babylonians in around 586 BC. After these events took place, Baal kind of vanishes from the Israelite mind. By the time they returned to the land had changed power so many times that Baal was a distant memory. They returned to a land under Persian satrapy, and continued under the auspices of Persians and later Greeks worshipping their own gods. When the Greeks gave them guff about their religious practices, it wasn't Baal that they were trying to enforce worship of, but rather the gods of Greece, although they did identify some of those gods, namely Zeus, with Baal, and so some insult to injury was offered there. That's about all I have to say. Really appreciate you sticking with me. One thing I did want to say, and it's not like, comment, subscribe, is just thanks to everybody who actually watches these videos. I know I'm just a small dude on the internet, but honestly, just seeing people watch these, comment. There's a couple of you who comment regularly. I've never met you in real life, but honestly, it's just so cool to see you guys engaging. All of that really keeps me accountable to keep researching these things and to keep studying. Some days it's a slog to get up and read dense textbooks. Some days it's a slog to get up and brush up on all the ancient languages I've studied. It really is a burden some days. But you guys keep me accountable to keep getting up and keep doing it, and keep recording even after it gets dark outside. And hopefully the quality of stuff that I'm putting out is continuing to improve, because honestly, I think that you deserve it. I mean, look, I've got ambient lighting now. I've got a microphone. These are all things that you guys recommended. So I'm planning to keep making stuff like this, but just thanks to everybody who's regularly interacting, who's watching these things, and who's letting me know what you think. It really does mean the world. So Anyways, that's getting really sappy. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys soon.